My son said, "Dad's $100 million fortune is all mine." Then the will's first line crushed them. My son looked across the polished mahogany table, his eyes sweeping past me as if I were a ghost. He smirked, a cruel, confident expression that twisted his handsome features into something ugly. "Dad's $100 million fortune is all mine," he announced to the room of tense relatives. "It's only natural." Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The air in Helen Cross's office, 40 floors above Boston's financial district, was already suffocating. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the silence. It felt like a tomb, a glass and steel mausoleum for a life's work. My son, Edward, sat in the center chair, the one my late husband Richard always took. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, the picture of a king who had just inherited his kingdom. His wife, Cynthia, placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm, her smile a mirror of his own entitlement. I sat in a corner, trying to make myself small. For days, I had been adrift in a fog of grief. But at that moment, watching my son dismiss the 40 years I had poured into building our empire alongside his father, something else sparked through the sorrow. A cold, hard anger. Helen, my oldest friend and our family's lawyer for decades, ignored Edward's pronouncement. Her face, etched with the wisdom of her 78 years, was a mask of professional neutrality. With deliberate slowness, she broke the wax seal on the large manila envelope. The crackle of the paper was like a gunshot in the silent room. She cleared her throat, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I will now read the last will and testament of Richard Ellington." Edward's smirk widened. He gave Cynthia's hand a little squeeze. He was so certain, so arrogant. He had no idea what his father truly thought of him. Helen adjusted her glasses and began to read. The first line landed with the force of a physical blow. "Before all else, my entire estate, its assets, and its control fall under the stewardship of my beloved wife, Margaret Ellington." A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the remaining air from the room. The only sound was the incessant tick-tock of the grandfather clock against the wall, each tick a hammer blow against my son's shattered pride. The smirk on Edward's face didn't just vanish. It froze, then crumbled. The blood drained from his face, leaving a pale, sickly mask of disbelief. I watched the color shift from angry red to ashen white. Cynthia's hand, which had been resting so adoringly on his arm, now gripped it like a vice. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the dead silence. And me? I lifted my chin. For the first time since Richard's passing, the heavy cloak of grief felt a little lighter. The fog in my mind cleared, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. My gaze met Edward's across the room. His eyes were wide with fury and betrayal. But I did not flinch. I just sat there, my back straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I was no longer a ghost in the corner. I was the steward. The crystal chandelier in the Beacon Hill dining room, the one Richard and I had bought in Vienna on our 10th anniversary, cast a warm, familiar glow over the table. But nothing felt familiar that night. It was a week before the will reading, and the house already felt like it belonged to someone else. My son, Edward, and his wife, Cynthia, had insisted on hosting a family dinner. It was, they said, what his father would have wanted. The table was set for 12, with the same Ellington silver and china we'd used for 40 years of holidays and celebrations. I walked towards the head of the table, to the high-backed chair that had been mine for every one of those meals. It was a small comfort, a piece of normalcy in the chaos of grief. But as I reached for it, Edward stepped smoothly in front of me, a practiced, charming smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Mother," he said, his voice soft but firm, "why don't you take the seat here, to the right? It's a place of honor." I froze, my hand hovering in the air. "But Edward, this is my chair." "It was," he corrected gently, pulling the chair out for himself. "But that position now belongs to the new head of the family." He sat down, a king ascending his throne, and gestured for Cynthia to take the seat on his other side, the one that had always been Richard's. A cold shock went through me. I stood there for a moment, stunned into silence as the rest of the family filed in, their eyes darting between me, Edward, and the empty chair of honor he had offered me. They saw the coup d'etat happening in real time. No one said a word. Swallowing my pride, a bitter pill, I took the lesser seat. The dinner was torture. Edward held court, pontificating about his grand vision for the company. He spoke not of building, but of dismantling. "We'll need to liquidate some of the non-essential assets," he declared, swirling a glass of obscenely expensive Bordeaux. "That old vineyard in Napa, for instance, it's more of a passion project, hardly profitable." My fork clattered against my plate. The vineyard wasn't a line item on a balance sheet. It was where Richard had proposed to me. It was where we spent every autumn. It was a part of our soul. Edward spoke of it as if it were a rusty piece of equipment to be sold for scrap. Cynthia nodded along, her eyes gleaming. "A brilliant move, darling. Streamlining. It's what the company needs to move into the future." He treated me with a distant, polite reverence, like a visiting dignitary or a relic from a bygone era. He'd ask, "Are you comfortable, Mother?" Or, "Can we get you anything else?" But his eyes would slide right past me. I was a ghost at my own table, in my own home. The house I had designed, the menu I had taught our cook, the family I had raised. None of it felt like mine anymore. Finally, I couldn't take another moment. I placed my napkin on the table and stood up. "If you'll all excuse me, I'm very tired." A chorus of polite goodbyes followed me out of the dining room. Edward walked me to the grand foyer. He placed a cold hand on my arm, leaning in as if to share a secret. His voice was a low whisper, meant only for me, a final twist of the knife. "From now on, Mother," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "You're just a guest here." I pulled my arm away as if his touch had burned me. I didn't look back. I walked out into the crisp Boston autumn air, my heart feeling like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. In the reflection of the polished black door, I saw Cynthia's triumphant smirk before it closed, shutting me out. That look, and that empty chair at the head of my table, were seared into my mind. The pain was immense, but beneath it, something new and hard was beginning to form. It was the cold, sharp edge of resolve. That night, the silence in the Beacon Hill mansion was a living thing. It was heavy and suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. Edward's parting words, "You're just a guest here," echoed in the cavernous halls. I couldn't bear the thought of my own bedroom, so I found myself in Richard's study, a room that still smelled faintly of his cigar smoke and old leather. I ran my hand over his mahogany desk, my fingers tracing the worn grain of the wood. My eyes landed on a silver-framed photograph on the corner of the desk. Our family, 25 years ago. Richard and I were smiling, but a young Edward, standing slightly apart, wore a strained expression. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. Picking up the cool, heavy frame, I sank into Richard's armchair, and the memories came flooding back, unbidden. I saw Edward at 20, home from Harvard for the summer. He was bursting with energy, his face alight with passion. He had spent weeks developing a business proposal, a plan to expand into affordable, eco-friendly housing. He'd stood in this very room, spreading blueprints across this very desk, his voice trembling with a mixture of nerves and excitement. "It's the future, Dad," he'd insisted. "We can build a legacy that's not just about profit, but about community." Richard, a brilliant man but a demanding perfectionist, had listened with a stony expression. He scanned the meticulously prepared documents, his lips a thin, unimpressed line. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were quiet, but they cut Edward down to size. "A naive idea," he'd said, pushing the blueprints aside. "The margins are too thin. The risks are too high. You have a lot to learn before you start talking about legacies, son." I remembered the light going out of Edward's eyes. He had crumpled, not just his plans, but his spirit. He never brought up another original idea to his father again. Another memory surfaced, sharp and painful. A gala at the Museum of Fine Arts a few years later. We were standing with a major investor, a man Richard had been courting for months. The man clapped Richard on the back. "You've built an incredible empire, Ellington, a true titan." Richard had smiled and wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me closer. "I can't take all the credit," he'd said, his voice booming with pride. "My wife here, Margaret, she's the real genius behind it all." It was meant as the highest compliment, a public declaration of his love and respect for me, and I loved him for it. But over his shoulder, I saw Edward's face. I saw the flicker of pain, the tightening of his jaw before he forced a smile. His father's praise for me was, in his ears, another confirmation of his own inadequacy. He wasn't the Titan's son, the heir apparent. He was just a footnote in the story of his brilliant parents. Staring at the photograph in my hands, it all clicked into place with a terrible, soul-crushing clarity. My son's monstrous greed, his chilling ambition. It wasn't just about the money. It was never just about the money. It was a desperate, lifelong hunger for the one thing his father's $100 million could never buy: recognition. He didn't want to inherit a fortune. He wanted to conquer it, to prove that he was the rightful king, to finally step out of Richard's long shadow. A wave of emotion washed over me, so complex it made my head spin. The anger was still there, a hot coal in my chest. But now it was mixed with a profound, aching pity. I was furious with the man my son had become, but I grieved for the boy whose passion had been dismissed as naive. I saw him not as a villain, but as a man warped by a lifetime of perceived slights, blinded by insecurity and a desperate need to measure up. I realized then that this fight wasn't just about protecting a fortune from a greedy child. I was fighting the ghost of his father's approval and the deep, festering wounds it had left behind. The pity I felt for Edward was a fleeting, fragile thing. It dissolved as my gaze drifted from the photograph to the framed architectural drawings hanging on the study wall. The first luxury apartment building we ever built, the one that put Ellington Properties on the map. And my own history, the one no one ever spoke of, rose up to meet me. The memories were so vivid they felt like the present. I was back in our tiny first apartment, the one with the leaky faucet and the view of a brick wall. The air was thick with the smell of brewing coffee and Richard's frustration. He was a brilliant architect, a visionary, but when it came to the numbers, he was lost at sea. I remembered nights spent hunched over the kitchen table, long after he had gone to bed in despair, reworking the budgets, finding efficiencies he'd missed, my fingers stained with ink. He would wake up in the morning to find a fresh set of calculations and a viable plan. He was the artist. I was the one who made the art profitable. I remembered the investors. Richard, with his unyielding perfectionism, could be abrasive. He didn't suffer fools gladly, and in his mind, most people who controlled the money were fools. I can still see the face of Mr. Abernathy, a banking magnate, red with anger after Richard had called his design suggestions pedestrian. Richard had nearly blown the entire deal sky high. That weekend, I was the one who arranged a chance encounter at a charity polo match. I was the one who spent an hour talking to Mrs. Abernathy about her prize-winning roses, who listened patiently to Mr. Abernathy's long-winded stories about his college days. I was the one who, with a carefully crafted comment about honoring historical integrity while embracing modern finance, smoothed his ruffled feathers and saved the deal. Richard got the handshake and the credit. I got the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had held it all together. But the sharpest memory, the one that cut through the decades, was from the crash of '87. We were over-leveraged, exposed. Our creditors were calling in their loans, and the bank was about to foreclose. Richard was devastated. He sat in this very study, his head in his hands, ready to declare bankruptcy, ready to throw in the towel on our entire dream. He saw nothing but ruin. I saw a lifeline. The next morning, I didn't consult him. I didn't ask for permission. I went to the bank, but not to beg for an extension. I went to my personal safe deposit box. Inside was the gold my father had given me as a dowry, a substantial collection of coins and small bars, a relic of an older time, a symbol of old-world security. It was my inheritance, my safety net. And without a second thought, I liquidated every last ounce of it. The bank manager was stunned. By noon, the infusion of cash was enough to satisfy our most aggressive creditor and restore faith in the others. We weren't just saved, we were solvent. I had put it all on the line, betting my entire personal security on our shared dream. Richard was the face of the company, the handsome, charismatic visionary whose name was on every building. But I was the foundation. I was the steel beams hidden behind the marble facade, the unseen bedrock upon which the entire $100 million empire was built. Edward never knew. Richard and I never told him. Perhaps we should have. Sitting there in the deep silence of the study, the hurt from the dinner party began to recede. The sting of my son's dismissal faded. These memories weren't sources of pain, reminders of being overlooked. They were sources of power. They were the receipts for my 40 years of sweat, sacrifice, and savvy. They were my claim to the throne. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like a cold drink of water on a hot day, that I wasn't just fighting for Richard's legacy. I was fighting for my own. The 2 days leading up to the will reading were a special kind of hell. My newfound resolve, forged in the quiet of Richard's study, began to crack under the immense pressure of what I was about to do. I was a mother, and I was about to financially execute my only son. The memories of his cruelty at the dinner party warred with memories of holding his small hand as we crossed the street, of his face lighting up on Christmas morning. By Tuesday morning, I was a wreck. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think. So I did the only thing I could. I went to see Helen. Her office wasn't the sterile, glass-walled conference room where we would soon gather. Her personal office was a sanctuary, smelling of old books and Earl Grey tea. Sunlight filtered through the windows, falling on shelves crammed with legal texts and worn leather-bound classics. It was a room that valued wisdom over wealth. Helen looked up from her desk as I entered, her expression softening when she saw the state I was in. "Margaret," she said, her voice full of a warmth that belied her sharp legal mind. "I was just thinking of you." I sank into the plush armchair opposite her desk, the dam of my composure finally breaking. "Helen, am I doing the right thing?" The words came out in a ragged whisper. "This feels monstrous. He's my son. Are we being too cruel?" Helen didn't answer right away. She listened, letting the weight of my question hang in the air between us. She let me feel my doubt, my guilt. Then she pushed her chair back, the caster silent on the thick Persian rug. She walked over to a large, imposing safe tucked behind a framed map of 19th century Boston. With a series of precise clicks, she opened the heavy door. She reached inside and pulled out a small, locked metal box. From a chain around her neck, she produced a tiny key and opened it. My breath caught in my throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single letter. The stationery yellowed with age. Richard's bold, familiar handwriting was unmistakable. "Richard left this with me 15 years ago," Helen said, her voice soft. "He told me to give it to you only if you ever found yourself in an impossible situation regarding the company and Edward." She brought the letter over to her desk, handling it with the reverence one would give a sacred text. She unfolded it carefully, the paper crinkling with age. She didn't hand it to me. Instead, she began to read a passage aloud, her voice channeling the love and the worry I remembered so well in my husband's. "My dearest Margaret," she read, "if you are reading this, then my greatest fear has come to pass. You know I love our boy, but his pride, his damned Ellington pride, mixed with that chip on his shoulder, I worry it will be the ruin of him. I worry his arrogance will make him tear down everything we spent our lives building, just to prove he can. He'll sell it for parts, chasing the next shiny thing, and our legacy will turn to dust." Helen paused, her eyes meeting mine over the top of the letter. Then she read the final crucial line. "My love, I am making you the guardian of our dream. Promise me. Promise me you will be its protector. Promise me you will save it from anyone who tries to harm it, even from the son we love the most, if it ever comes to that." The tears that had been threatening all morning finally fell. They weren't tears of grief or doubt. They were tears of release. It was as if Richard himself were in the room, taking the unbearable weight of the decision off my shoulders and placing his hand on mine. It wasn't a betrayal of my son. It was a fulfillment of a promise to my husband. Helen folded the letter and put it back in its box. She came around the desk and placed a firm, comforting hand on my shoulder. "You are not being cruel, Margaret," she said, her gaze steady and sure. "You are being the protector he asked you to be." I looked up at my oldest friend, my tears subsiding, my heart settling. The conflict that had been tearing me apart was gone. In its place was a profound and unshakable peace. I was no longer a mother wrestling with a terrible choice. I was a wife, honoring a sacred vow. The night before the reading was unnaturally still, the kind of deep, heavy silence that precedes a storm. The old house on Beacon Hill seemed to be holding its breath along with me. Sleep was a country I knew I couldn't visit, so I didn't even try. Instead, I went to my dressing room and knelt before the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Lifting the heavy lid, the scent of lavender and aged wood filled the air, a fragrance of my entire adult life. Beneath a stack of photo albums and my wedding veil, wrapped in yellowing tissue paper, was a simple, dark-grained wooden box. It wasn't ornate or expensive, just a box Richard had made in his workshop years ago. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted it out and placed it on my bed. The latch was simple, a small brass hook. I opened it. Inside, on a bed of faded blue silk, lay a document. It was our copy of the will, the one we had drafted with Helen over a decade ago. It wasn't the official, sealed version that sat in Helen's safe, but in a way, this one was more real. This was the one we had held. I remembered the day we signed it with a clarity that defied the years. We weren't in some stuffy lawyer's office. We were at the lake house in the Berkshires, sitting on the screened-in porch as a summer thunderstorm rolled in over the water. The air was charged with ozone and the smell of rain on pine needles. Richard had been quiet for a long time, staring out at the lightning illuminating the distant hills. He wasn't sick then, not yet, but he was a man who always planned for every contingency. He finally turned to me, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "This document, Maggie," he had said, tapping the papers with his forefinger. "It's more than just a list of assets. It's a responsibility." He picked up the heavy fountain pen, the one I'd given him for his 50th birthday. He didn't sign right away. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze intense, searching. "Our legacy is for building, not for wasting," he said, his voice low and firm, a counterpoint to the rumbling thunder outside. "It's for creating opportunities, for preserving a little bit of beauty in the world. It's not a piggy bank for someone to smash open." He was talking about Edward. He didn't have to say his name. We both knew. "It will be safe in your hands. Only in your hands." Then, with a steady, deliberate motion, he signed his name. The signature was bold and confident, just like the man himself. He pushed the document across the table to me, and I signed below his. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a vow renewal. We were partners, protectors, guardians of a shared dream. Sitting on my bed, all those years later, I gently lifted the document from its silk cradle. The paper felt heavy, important. I ran my thumb over Richard's signature, the ink slightly raised against the page. And in that simple touch, a powerful connection sparked across the void of death and grief. I wasn't alone in this fight. He was there with me, his conviction flowing into me, reinforcing my own. The promise we made on that stormy afternoon was still alive, still binding. A strange and profound calm settled over me. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for days simply evaporated. The turmoil in my heart was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid certainty. I was no longer a wounded mother about to do battle with her son. I was the keeper of a promise. I was the guardian of a legacy. I placed the will back in its box, closed the lid, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of absolute peace. I was ready for tomorrow. We were back in the present, in the suffocating silence of Helen's 40th floor office, the echo of that first devastating line from the will. My entire estate fall under the stewardship of my beloved wife, Margaret Ellington, still hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. The ticking of the clock was the only sound, each second a drop of water on the stone of my son's disbelief. Edward was a statue of fury. His face, which had been pale with shock, was now suffused with a dark, mottled red. He looked like he was going to explode. Cynthia's hand was still clamped on his arm, her knuckles white, her own face a mask of chalky horror. The carefully constructed facade of the grieving, supportive daughter-in-law had been obliterated. All that was left was raw, naked greed, now thwarted. Helen, unperturbed by the storm of emotion brewing in front of her, simply paused, let the weight of the moment settle, and then continued reading in that same calm, measured voice. All assets, including all shares in Ellington Properties, all real estate holdings, and all liquid investments, are to be consolidated into a single entity. She read, her eyes fixed on the page. This entity shall be known as the Ellington Legacy Trust. A low murmur rippled through the assembled relatives. The word trust was a thunderclap, a word that every wealthy family understood meant one thing above all else: control. Helen continued, her voice cutting cleanly through the whispers. The sole trustee, vested with the absolute and unrestricted authority to manage, invest, and disburse the funds of this trust, will be my wife, Margaret Ellington. She looked up for a moment, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on me with a flicker of affirmation. I met her eyes and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. My son, Edward Ellington, Helen read on, and I could feel Edward lean forward, a desperate, hungry look in his eyes. Will be provided for. He is to receive a monthly stipend from the trust's earnings. She then read the amount. It was a generous sum, more than enough for him and Cynthia to live a life of complete comfort, to maintain their cars and their club memberships. But it was a salary, not a fortune. It was an allowance, not an empire. It was nowhere near enough to fund the lavish, high-flying lifestyle they craved. And then, Helen delivered the final crushing blow. This stipend is conditional, she read, the legal language cold and precise. It is contingent upon his continued demonstration of respect and appropriate behavior toward the trustee, his mother. The sole arbiter of what constitutes respectful and appropriate behavior will be the trustee herself, Margaret Ellington. She retains the right to reduce, suspend, or terminate these payments at her sole discretion. At no point will my son have direct access to or control over any of the trust's principal capital. It was done. The trap had been sprung. The stunned silence in the room finally broke. Edward's shock curdled into a visible, trembling rage. His chair scraped violently against the floor as he half rose, his hands clenched into fists on the mahogany table. Cynthia's face, if possible, grew even whiter. Her perfectly applied lipstick stood out like a slash of blood against her pale skin. The whispers from the cousins and aunts escalated into a buzz of shocked gossip. They weren't on my side or Edward's. They were simply spectators at a drama more compelling than any they could buy a ticket for. Through it all, I sat perfectly still. I straightened my back, feeling the strength flow back into my limbs. The weight of grief had been replaced by the weight of responsibility. And it felt right. It felt like coming home. My gaze locked with Edward's. He looked at me with pure, undiluted hatred. He saw a thief, a traitor. I looked back, my expression calm, my eyes as placid as a frozen lake. For the first time in his adult life, he was seeing me not as his mother, but as the woman who held his entire world in the palm of her hand. Helen folded the document, placed it back in the manila envelope, and formally declared the reading concluded. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound in the room was the frantic, excited whispering of our relatives. Edward remained frozen in his chair, his face a thunderous mask. I watched him, waiting. I knew it was coming. The pressure inside him had been building to an impossible level, and it had to blow. It started with a low growl, a sound from deep in his chest. Then, with a surge of raw fury, he slammed both hands flat on the mahogany table. The sound cracked through the room like a rifle shot, making several people jump. "No!" he roared, shoving his chair back as he shot to his feet. The heavy chair screeched against the polished floor. "I don't accept this. This is a fraud." His eyes, wild and bloodshot, found mine. He pointed a trembling finger at me, then swung it toward Helen, who sat watching him with the calm disinterest of a scientist observing a specimen. "This is a scam. The two of you cooked this up behind my back," he bellowed, his voice hoarse with rage. "My father would never have done this. Never. You got to him when he was sick. You poisoned his mind against me, and he snarled, turning on Helen. You broke your fiduciary duty. You helped her manipulate him. The accusations were so baseless, so ludicrous. They were almost laughable, but there was no humor in the room, only the ugly spectacle of a grown man completely unraveling. "I'll sue," he shouted, his face now inches from mine across the table. I could feel the heat of his breath, smell the expensive cologne now soured by his rage. "I'll drag you both to court. I'll tie this estate up in litigation for years. You will not get away with this. I will expose you for the thieves you are." Beside him, Cynthia was in a full-blown panic. But her panic wasn't for her husband's state of mind. It was for the optics of the situation. She grabbed his arm, her red nails digging into the sleeve of his $1,000 suit. "Edward, stop it," she hissed, her voice a frantic whisper. "Edward, for God's sake, everyone is watching you. Think of our reputation." Her eyes darted around the room, assessing the damage not to her husband's soul, but to their social standing. She wasn't trying to calm a grieving son. She was trying to muzzle a public relations disaster. He shook her off, his focus entirely on me. He was waiting for me to scream back, to argue, to break down. He wanted a fight. He needed one. But I simply looked at him. I held his furious, hate-filled gaze and felt nothing. No fear, no anger, not even pity anymore. All I saw was a little boy in a man's body, red-faced and screaming because someone had taken away his favorite, shiniest toy. His rage wasn't the roar of a lion. It was the tantrum of a spoiled child. The threats of lawsuits, the wild accusations. It was all just noise. The desperate, flailing powerlessness of someone who had just realized he had no power at all. For the first time, I saw him clearly. Not as my son, not as the heir to an empire, but as a small, hollow man, dwarfed by the shadow of a father he could never emulate and a mother he had never understood. And in that moment, he had never looked smaller to me. My silence was a wall he couldn't breach. It infuriated him more than any argument could have. With one last guttural cry of frustration, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard that a painting on the wall rattled. Cynthia, after shooting me a look of pure venom, scurried after him, her high heels clicking frantically on the marble floor. The room was left in a stunned, ringing silence, broken only by the steady, implacable ticking of the clock. That evening, I was in the main drawing room, a fire crackling in the hearth, a welcome defense against the chill autumn night. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the house didn't feel empty or hostile. It felt like mine again. I was reading, a cup of chamomile tea steaming on the table beside me, when the doorbell chimed through the quiet halls. My housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, appeared at the doorway a moment later, her expression a mixture of surprise and disapproval. "Ma'am," she said, "it's Mr. Edward and his wife." I closed my book, a strange sense of calm washing over me. The actors had arrived for their second performance of the day. "Show them in, please, Mrs. Gable." They entered the room looking like a pair of chastened children. The wild, cornered animals from Helen's office were gone. In their place were two people performing a masterclass in phony contrition. Edward's face was arranged in lines of deep, sorrowful regret. Cynthia hovered beside him, her expression one of gentle, wifely concern. Edward didn't wait. He rushed forward, stopping just short of my chair. "Mother," he began, his voice a soft, saccharine coo that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Mother, I am so sorry. I don't know what came over me today." He hung his head, the picture of shame. I was in shock, overwhelmed by grief for father and the pressure of it all. I behaved like a monster. Can you ever forgive me? It was a stunning performance. If I hadn't witnessed his snarling, venomous rage just hours before, I might have almost believed him. I said nothing, simply gesturing to the sofa opposite my armchair. They sat, perched on the edge of the cushions like nervous birds. "We've been talking all afternoon," Edward continued, reaching for Cynthia's hand. "And we realized how selfish we've been. This entire burden, the weight of the estate, it's all falling on your shoulders. It's too much for one person to handle, especially now." He was laying it on so thick, I was surprised he didn't drown in it. "Family has to stick together at times like this," he said, his eyes shining with unshed crocodile tears. "That's what Father would have wanted, for us to be a team. I want to help you, Mother. Let me help you manage the trust. We can make the decisions together, share the load. It's the only way to honor his memory properly." Cynthia, right on cue, leaned forward, her face a mask of earnest sincerity. "He's right, Mother Ellington," she chimed in. "We only want to help. We're just worried about you, that's all." I watched them, my expression placid. It was all so transparent, so clumsy. They weren't skilled manipulators. They were desperate amateurs. They didn't see a mother they loved. They saw a vault they had been locked out of. And they were trying every key they could think of, no matter how ill-fitting. Without a word, I rose and went to the antique tea cart. I picked up the silver teapot, my movements slow and deliberate. I could feel their eyes following me, their hopeful, greedy silence filling the room. I poured the steaming water over fresh tea leaves in a porcelain cup, the fragrant steam rising to meet me. The simple ritual was calming, a small anchor of civilization in a sea of their deceit. I carried the cup and saucer back to the coffee table and set it down gently on the polished wood. The soft clink of porcelain against mahogany was the only sound. They both stared at the cup as if it held the answer to all their prayers. Then I looked up, meeting my son's gaze directly for the first time that evening. I let him see the calm in my eyes, the complete and utter absence of the anger he expected or the weakness he hoped for. "Respect," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment, "is not something I can buy for you with money, Edward." A week later, I stood at a podium in the Grand Hall of Boston City Hall. The room was packed. The glare of television lights was hot on my face, and the air was filled with the low hum of reporters' voices and the constant, frantic clicking of camera shutters. This was a world away from the hushed, poisonous atmosphere of a lawyer's office. This was a public stage, and I had chosen it very deliberately. My son's lawyers had already sent their first volley, a series of threatening letters to Helen, full of bluster about contesting the will on grounds of undue influence and testamentary incapacity. They were predictable, clumsy moves, the legal equivalent of a child's tantrum. My response would not be a letter. It would be a public declaration, a strategic move on the chessboard that would render his king powerless. I adjusted the microphone, my hand steady. I looked out at the sea of faces, journalists, city officials, and the heads of various local charities whom I had personally invited. I saw no fear in their eyes, only curiosity. "Good morning," I began, my voice clear and amplified, filling every corner of the hall. "I want to thank you all for coming. For 40 years, my late husband, Richard Ellington, and I built a life and a business in this city. We believe that with great success comes great responsibility, a responsibility not just to ourselves, but to the community that allowed us to flourish." I let that sink in. I was framing the narrative, setting the terms of the debate before it even began. This wasn't about a family squabble over money. This was about civic duty. In his final wishes, Richard entrusted me with the stewardship of our life's work, which has now been consolidated into a charitable entity, the Ellington Legacy Trust. I paused, letting the official name hang in the air. Today, I am honored to announce the first two major initiatives of that trust. The clicking of cameras intensified. First, we will be establishing the Ellington Scholars Program. This will be a perpetual, fully funded scholarship for gifted students from underprivileged backgrounds here in Massachusetts who wish to pursue degrees in architecture and business. We want to invest in the next generation of builders and innovators, those with the talent but not the means to create the future. It was a direct hit, and I knew it. Edward's entire identity was wrapped up in an inheritance he felt he was owed. I was redefining the Ellington name to be about merit, not bloodline. Secondly, I continued, the trust will fully fund the complete restoration of the historic Orpheum Theater. This landmark, a jewel of our city's past, has fallen into disrepair. We will bring it back to its former glory, ensuring that its legacy of art and culture can be enjoyed for generations to come. I leaned forward slightly, my voice imbued with a new passion. The mission of the Ellington Legacy Trust is simple: to invest in the future and preserve the past. Our family's legacy will not be one of private wealth hoarded behind closed doors. It will be a living, breathing part of Boston, open to everyone. It was checkmate. The $100 million fortune was no longer just a pile of money for a greedy son to covet. I had transformed it. I had wrapped it in the noble causes of education for the poor and the preservation of culture. Any legal challenge Edward mounted now would not be against his mother. It would be an attack on scholarship students. It would be an attempt to defund the arts. In the court of public opinion, I had just made him a villain. When I finished speaking, there was a moment of silence, followed by a sudden, powerful wave of applause. It started with the city officials and charity heads, then spread to the reporters. It was warm, genuine, and loud. Standing there, bathed in the flashing lights, I felt no sense of vengeful triumph. I felt a deep, profound rightness. I had taken my family's name, which my son sought to tarnish with his greed, and I had polished it into something that truly shined. The weeks following the press conference were quiet. The threatening letters from Edward's lawyers stopped abruptly. My public maneuver had worked exactly as I'd intended. They knew that dragging the Ellington Legacy Trust through a messy court battle would be a public relations nightmare. For the first time since Richard's death, a sense of normalcy began to return to my life. I had reclaimed my home, and now I was reclaiming my peace. I spent most of my days in my home office, a bright, sunlit room overlooking the private garden at the back of our Beacon Hill home. It had once been a formal sitting room, but I had transformed it into my command center, replacing stuffy antiques with a large, functional desk, comfortable chairs, and shelves filled with books on finance and philanthropy. One crisp November afternoon, a small stack of mail sat on my desk. Tucked between the usual assortment of magazines and correspondence was a simple cream-colored envelope addressed to me in elegant, youthful handwriting. There was no return address, just a local Boston postmark. Curious, I slid it open with a silver letter opener. Inside was a single sheet of matching stationery. The letter was from a young woman named Sarah Chen. "Dear Mrs. Ellington," the letter began. "I don't know if you will ever read this, but I had to write to you. My name is Sarah, and I am the first recipient of the Ellington Scholars Program. When I received the news, I sat down on my front steps and cried for an hour. My parents, who worked 2 jobs each just to make ends meet, cried with me. All my life, I have dreamed of being an architect. I've spent hours of my childhood sketching the beautiful old buildings in this city, dreaming of one day designing my own. But for a family like mine, a degree from a top university felt like an impossible dream. Your scholarship hasn't just given me tuition money, it has given me a future. It has given my dream a chance to become real. I read about your husband, about his own start as a young, ambitious architect. I want you to know that I will not take this opportunity for granted. I will work every single day to be worthy of the faith you have placed in me. I will build things that are beautiful and strong. I promise I will not let you, or his memory, down. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. I read the letter twice, my vision blurring with tears. They were not tears of sadness, but of a profound, quiet joy that seemed to fill the room. I looked up at the photograph of Richard on my desk, the one of him laughing on the deck of our boat in Cape Cod. This was the legacy he had wanted. Not a cold, sterile number in a bank account, but a living, breathing force for good in the world. This young woman's dream was now a part of our story. At that exact moment, my phone, which was sitting on the desk beside the letter, buzzed softly. I glanced at the screen. It was a notification from the bank's trust department. Alert. Scheduled transfer to Edward Ellington in the amount of redacted has been successfully completed. I stared at the two messages, side by side. On my right, a handwritten letter, brimming with hope and gratitude, the embodiment of a future we were helping to build. On my left, a cold digital notification, the dispassionate confirmation of a boundary I had been forced to create. One was an investment in a dream. The other was the management of a disappointment. There was no triumph in seeing the bank alert, no sense of victory. There was only a quiet finality. It was a simple transaction, a number just sufficient for a comfortable life, no more, no less. It was the last, definitive statement of my control, my choice. I was the steward. And this was stewardship in all its forms, nurturing the worthy and containing the unworthy. I picked up Sarah's letter again, its tangible reality a comfort. This was real. This was the true inheritance. This was the Ellington legacy, finally in the right hands. The late summer sun, a brilliant buttery gold, streamed through the large picture windows of the lake house in the Berkshires. It was a different kind of light than the formal, filtered sun that fell through the tall windows in Boston. This light was warm, alive, and it filled every corner of the room I now called my own. After the press conference, I had packed a single bag, leaving the grand, silent mansion on Beacon Hill behind. It was a house of ghosts and expectations, a monument to a life that was no longer mine. This house, the one Richard and I had always called our escape, was now my sanctuary, and for the first time, I had decorated it entirely for myself. The heavy, dark furniture was gone, replaced with comfortable armchairs upholstered in light linen. The somber oil paintings of long-dead ancestors were replaced with vibrant watercolors of the surrounding landscape. On the shelves were not leather-bound classics, but the novels I loved, their spines cracked from countless readings. The whole house felt lighter, freer. It felt like me. I sat in a plush chaise lounge by the window, a book lying open but unread in my lap. Beside me, a cup of chamomile tea sent a fragrant wisp of steam into the air. Outside, the lake was a sheet of sapphire glass, reflecting the fiery colors of the setting sun. There were no ringing phones, no demanding emails, no unexpected visitors appearing at my door with false apologies. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of a loon. The silence was the greatest luxury of all. It was a silence born not of loneliness, but of peace. I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop, no longer bracing for the next confrontation. The battle was over, and I had won. But the victory felt nothing like I had imagined. There was no thrill, no surge of adrenaline, only this profound and unshakable calm. I thought of Edward, but the memory had no power over me anymore. He was a distant figure, a man I had once known, trapped in a life of his own making. his comfort now entirely dependent on the mother he had tried to discard. I felt no anger, no resentment. I simply felt a quiet sense of finality. I had done what I had to do, not just for Richard or for the legacy, but for myself. I had refused to be erased. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange, pink, and deep violet. I didn't need the approval of my son. I didn't need the validation of Boston society. I didn't even need the memory of Richard's pride to know my own worth. I had built an empire, faced down my own child, and transformed a private fortune into a public good. I had earned this peace, this house, this life. I closed my book, took a final sip of my tea, and watched as the first star of the evening appeared in the darkening sky. I was 75 years old, a widow, and a mother to a son who despised me. And yet, I had never felt more whole, more powerful, or more completely and utterly free. I had reclaimed my house, my life, and my dignity, not by seeking revenge, but by simply, finally, choosing to honor myself. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.